She sat there at that press conference in Atlanta, cameras rolling, microphone hot, and she said the words herself, my ex-manager. Not former partner, not previous rep, not a guy I used to work with. Ex. Like ex-girlfriend, ex-husband, ex-somebody you broke up with. And the man she was pointing at, standing across the room in a dress shirt smiling for the flashes, is Mark Taffet, the same Mark Taffet who architected HBO boxing, the same Mark Taffet who's been in her corner since she went pro, the same Mark Taffet who a year ago was on record saying no woman on the planet could touch Claressa Shields inside a boxing ring. And now that same man is standing in the opposite corner, managing the woman she's about to fight. 10 years. 10 years of building, 10 years of gold medals, 10 years of undisputed belts, 10 years of we did it together, and it just quietly evaporated somewhere between last summer and this winter, with no announcement, no press release, no explanation, no goodbye. And I need you to understand something before we go one sentence further. The story you have been told about why Claressa Shields is signed to win records instead of MVP. The story you have been told about who is really calling the shots in her career. The story you have been told about Papoose being just the boyfriend, every version of that story falls apart the second you look at what happened to the man who used to actually run the boxing side of this operation. Because a manager didn't just disappear. A manager was removed. And the only question that actually matters at this point in her career is this: who benefited from that removal? And when we get to the pattern of decisions Claressa has made since that removal, and I promise you we are getting there, you're going to understand why her entire career for the last 12 months has been running on a track that somebody else laid down for her. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. Now let me set the table properly, because you cannot understand what just happened at that Atlanta press conference without understanding the entire 10-year architecture that got dismantled to make room for it. Claressa Shields is not a rookie. She is not a girl who stumbled into a paycheck. This is a two-time Olympic gold medalist. This is a woman who came out of Flint, Michigan, actual Flint, not the version people romanticize on Instagram, and became the most decorated female boxer in the history of the sport. Undisputed at middleweight. Undisputed at 154. Titles at 168. She stepped up to heavyweight and won belts there too. This is a resume that puts her in the same conversation as Ann Wolfe, Lucia Ridgker, Layla Ali on the all-time list. And the man who navigated her professional career through all of that, the man who set up her promotional partnerships, the man who negotiated her television deals, the man who structured the Savannah Marshall superfight in the UK that made Sky Sports history, that was Mark Taffet, former HBO boxing vice president. The guy who ran their pay-per-view division for decades. The guy who has been in boxing rooms since before Claressa Shields was born. That is not a manager you fire casually. That is not a manager you replace with a rapper from Brooklyn who has never negotiated a boxing contract in his life. And yet somewhere between the summer of last year and the winter after it, that is exactly what happened. And the timing of when it happened lines up perfectly, with the arrival of one specific person into her personal life. Because in that same window, Claressa Shields turned down offers from Eddie Hearn's Matchroom, from Jake Paul and Nakisa Bidarian's MVP, from established promoters with actual boxing infrastructure, and instead signed an $8 million deal with a company called Win Records. A record label. A record label whose head of hip-hop just so happens to be her new boyfriend, a married man named Papoose whose actual wife, Remy Ma, warned Claressa in real time that this exact pattern was going to play out. And what I want everybody watching to understand right now is that this is not a gossip story anymore. This stopped being a gossip story the moment a boxing manager with 30 years of institutional relationships got cleanly excised from a champions team and replaced by an operation that has never promoted a boxing card in its life. This is a business story. This is a career hijacking story. And the woman living through it either does not see it or will not admit it, which is why I have to. Let's start with the surface, because the surface is already loud enough that most people are missing what it's actually saying. At the Kaye press conference in Atlanta, on a live microphone, Claressa Shields herself confirmed it. She said, and I'm quoting the moment directly, "This is maybe the first time that my ex-manager Mark Taffet is on the opposite side of me representing somebody else." That is the champion telling you, in her own voice, that Mark Taffet is no longer her manager. It is not speculation, it is not a rumor, it is not something a blog reported. She said it into a microphone in front of an audience while a camera captured every second of it. And Mark Taffet was standing right there. And the fighter he is now managing, Kaye Scott, was standing right next to him. That is the first piece of evidence, and it is a receipt she handed us herself. But that is only the beginning of what the surface is showing us, because the paper trail on Mark Taffet's own social media backs up the timeline in a way that is almost too perfect. Go look at Mark Taffet Media's page. In July of last year, he was posting about Claressa's fight with Lonnie Daniels. He was doing sit-down interviews being introduced as, and I quote, the current manager of Claressa Shields. Photos with Papoose. Photos with Claressa. Photos with Dimitri Salita, her promoter. All smiles. All aligned. And then 5 months later, in December, he announces that Kaye Scott, a middleweight ranked in the WBO, is joining his team. Welcome to the roster. New client. And from that moment forward, the Mark Taffet Media page pivots. Suddenly it's Kaye Scott posts. Kaye Scott interviews. Kaye Scott photos. And the Claressa content just quietly stops appearing. There is no fight, no falling out, no public reason. 1 month he is her manager. The next month he is managing the woman lined up to fight her. That is not how professional boxing manager relationships end. That is how a manager gets shown the door and finds work with the closest available client on the way out. That is the second piece of evidence, and it is sitting on a public Instagram feed for anyone to scroll through. The third piece of surface evidence is what Claressa herself put on the record back in May of last year, and this is the one that boxes her into a corner she cannot get out of. When Remy Ma first started saying publicly that Papoose was managing Claressa's money and taking a cut, Claressa went on social media and shut it down aggressively. Her exact words, and I'm quoting the post, were, "Papoose is not my manager. Mark Taffet Media is my manager. I don't let nothing or nobody play with my money." That was May of last year. Now fast forward to Atlanta this month. Mark Taffet is confirmed as her ex-manager. So the question is not rhetorical, and it is not a gotcha, it is a real question that a champion of her stature owes her audience an answer to. If Papoose was never your manager, and Mark Taffet is now your ex-manager, then who is your manager? Because a 2-time Olympic gold medalist, an undisputed champion in 3 weight classes, a woman preparing for a title defense at State Farm Arena in Atlanta does not go through fight camp without management. That does not exist in professional boxing at her level. Management handles the contracts. Management handles the sanctioning body politics. Management handles the venue negotiations, the network relationships, the purse splits, the sponsorship activations. Someone is doing that job right now for Claressa Shields. She has told us who it is not. She has never told us who it is. And the fourth piece of surface evidence is the answer she seems to be dodging, which is what Google itself pulls up when you search for who manages Claressa Shields. The result says, and I want you to sit with this, that she manages her own career and directs her management team, working closely with her partner, the rapper Papoose, who helps oversee her career strategy, business, and major deals. She manages herself, working closely with Papoose, on strategy, on business, on major deals. That is not a boyfriend. That is a description of a co-manager. And if the champion herself hasn't corrected that description publicly, the way she corrected the BT caption she didn't like, the way she corrects everything else she doesn't like on the internet, then we are allowed to assume that description is not one she disagrees with. And oh, do I have more for you? The Papoose stans, the ones still on Twitter defending this man like he's the second coming of Dame Dash, they are not going to like what comes next. Because everything we've covered so far is just the paperwork. Just the public record. Just the receipts anybody with a search bar can pull. What we're about to get into is the cultural evidence, the stuff that happens between the lines, the stuff insiders have been screaming about for months, the stuff Remy Ma called from the jump when nobody wanted to hear her. And I promise you, when we connect the cultural evidence to the pattern of decisions Claressa has been making about her own career, you are going to see a picture that nobody in the boxing media has been brave enough to paint out loud yet. Stay locked in. This is where the story stops being a rumor and starts being a case. The most damning piece of cultural evidence in this entire saga is Remy Ma herself, because Remy told us how the movie was going to end while we were still watching the trailer. Go back to her early statements, the ones people wrote off at the time as a scorned wife lashing out. Remy said Papoose had no real income of his own. Remy said Papoose had a gambling problem. Remy said Papoose was talking circles around a young woman who hadn't lived enough life to see the play. Remy said Papoose was going to tell Claressa he wanted a son because he already has a son. And then Claressa went on video and said, unprompted, that Pap wants a boy so she wants a boy. Remy said Claressa was going to be sorry. And now the fight everybody expected against Christy Martin's protege, against a Hannah Gabriel's type name, against Chris Cyborg for the crossover, none of that is happening. Instead, its case got on DAZN with a Zeus-affiliated reality show Undercard featuring Ray J and Big Lex. Every single thing Remy warned about has landed. Every single thing. That is not a coincidence. That is a woman who was married to the man for over a decade, telling the public what she had already lived through, and the public choosing to believe the shinier version of the story because it was newer. The second piece of cultural evidence is the pawn shop receipt Remy posted from Jimmy Palm's brokers, dated November of 2 years ago, with what appears to be Papoose's signature and his legal name, itemizing jewelry that Remy says belongs to her. Papoose, in his own response video, admitted on camera to a gambling problem. His exact words were, "I fell victim to gambling. I can admit that," but then in the very same breath tried to argue, it never affected her. It never affected her at all. How does a gambling addiction not affect the household when there is a public pawn shop invoice with the household's jewelry listed on it? Even Claressa's own friend has publicly said Claressa had to repurchase a designer handbag because it went missing. That is a pattern. That is cultural evidence that lives outside of Claressa's PR machine. The third piece of cultural evidence is the receipts that came out of the direct message archives between Remy and Claressa going back to 2020. These two were friendly. They were exchanging fashion advice during the pandemic. Remy was congratulating Claressa on making history in the Olympics. Claressa was calling Remy a boss and telling her she respected her. That relationship existed for years before Papoose ever became a public presence in Claressa's life. Which means Claressa knew exactly who Remy was, exactly who Remy was married to, exactly what she was walking into when she started communicating with him privately. And Remy has publicly stated that Claressa was in Papoose's inbox first, a claim that Papoose himself confirmed on a podcast, saying Claressa reached out to him. Which means the story that Claressa has been selling about how they met innocently at a Shakur Stevenson fight is not the whole story. That is the kind of thing that ends a friendship. That is the kind of thing that erases any moral high ground. And a champion who wanted to be respected as a couple would have gone to Remy first, woman to woman, and said, "I have feelings for your husband. I know your marriage is complicated. I want to be transparent." That conversation did not happen. Instead, there was a phone that got snooped through, an ex-wife who found out on her own, and a public relationship that launched under a cloud that has never actually dissipated. The fourth piece of cultural evidence is what Papoose said in his own video defending himself against Remy's accusations, because he told on his own financial situation without realizing it. He said, on camera, that when Remy went to prison years ago, he exhausted all his funds, bailing her out and running back and forth to the visitation. That is a direct quote. He exhausted all his funds. Which means the $2 million record deal from 2006 that he keeps referencing every time somebody questions his money, that money was gone by his own admission over a decade ago. So when Claressa is on the Breakfast Club telling Charlemagne that Pap pays for her flights and her mortgage and her car note and her insurance, when she's saying she hasn't paid for a hotel in months, we now have to ask on what income. Because the man himself, on his own microphone, told the world that he ran out of money years ago. And Remy, who knew him longer than Claressa has been an adult, said the same thing, the least earning man she'd ever been with. Two independent sources, one of them being the subject himself, saying the exact same thing. That is not gossip anymore. That is confirmation. And I want to acknowledge the counterargument here, because I have to be fair. Somebody watching this is going to say, well, Papoose has income streams we don't see. He's got a job at Win Records. He's got publishing catalog. He's got tour money. Fine. Show it. Because when Claressa was in the gym on video asking him for money, telling him on camera she needed some cash, he did not pull out a card. He did not say, "How much you need, babe?" He said, and I'm quoting the clip, that she needed to stay in shape so she'd be ready to fight. He redirected the money question into a boxing question. That is not the response of a man who is paying her mortgage. That is the response of a man whose income stream depends on her getting into that ring. Which, if you follow that thread all the way through, is a very different power dynamic than the one Claressa is presenting to the public. It sounds transactional. And when the transactional partner is also the one whispering in her ear about which manager to keep and which manager to release, you have crossed from personal relationship into professional interference. That is the gear shift. That is where this stops being a story about a boxer and her boyfriend and starts being a story about how the entire business infrastructure of a legendary athlete got quietly restructured around one man's financial needs. Now I have to shift gears completely, because everything we've talked about up to this point is the human drama on the surface, the relationship, the ex-wife, the missing manager, the missing jewelry. But there is a much bigger machine operating underneath the story, and if you understand how boxing management actually works, if you understand how record label ownership actually works, if you understand what a 360 deal actually looks like at the ownership level, this story goes from tabloid to industry indictment in about 90 seconds. Let me walk you through it in 3 layers. The first layer is the structure of the Win Records deal itself. Win Records was reportedly incorporated as an LLC only a year before Claressa signed with them. 1 year of operational history. No linear network deal like DAZN has with Matchroom, no output arrangement with ESPN or Sky Sports, no television partnership with Netflix the way MVP has with Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano. Their entire boxing infrastructure was built specifically around Claressa's arrival. That means the $8 million contract everyone keeps trumpeting is not being paid out of an established revenue base. It is being paid out of a projected revenue base that only exists if Claressa performs to the level that generates it. That is not a stable deal. That is a bet. And in that bet, Claressa is not the house, she is the chip. Papoose was on Drink Champs saying it was a bidding war, that Win beat out MVP and Matchroom and Eddie Hearn, and on the podcast promoting Papoose's role in this deal, he specifically said MVP's presentation was smart, professional, everything you'd want. He praised the competing offer. So the question that follows on its own is why the champion turned down the more established, more professional offer for the newer, less established one whose head of hip-hop division just so happens to be her boyfriend. That is layer 1. That is a structural conflict of interest that in any other industry, in Hollywood, in tech, in music, would trigger a formal disclosure requirement. In boxing there is no such requirement, which is exactly why this can happen. The second layer is what happens to a champion's earnings when you multiply the number of hands in the pot. In a standard MVP or Matchroom structure, you have the promoter, the manager, the trainer, the sanctioning body, and the fighter. 5 stakeholders. Roughly known percentages. Everybody's cut is transparent. In the Win Record structure that Claressa has walked into, you have the record label, Papoose in his role as executive, the promoter Salida, the manager who nobody can name publicly, the co-promotional Zeus deal for the undercard, the sanctioning bodies, the venue partnership, and the network split with DAZN. That is at minimum 7 or 8 stakeholders, and the moment you have that many hands in the cookie jar, the fighter's take on the back end has to shrink to make the math work. Which means the $8 million top-line number does not translate to $8 million in Claressa's pocket. It translates to whatever is left after every partner in this ecosystem takes their piece, and the ecosystem was built specifically to have more partners than a standard deal. That is not accidental. That is design. A manager whose only job is to protect the fighter's earnings would have looked at the structure and said no. Mark Taffet, 30 years in the game, HBO boxing background, is exactly the type of manager who would have said no. And now Mark Taffet is not her manager anymore. Connect the dots. The third layer is the media landscape being built around this deal, because a fight needs a broadcast partner to reach an audience, and Claressa's Kaye Scott fight is being pushed through DAZN pay-per-view with the Zeus network undercard. That means the consumer has to pay for 2 separate platforms to access the full night of boxing. DAZN for the main event, Zeus for the reality show co-feature. That is not how you build a broadcast blockbuster. That is how you fragment your own audience. MVP's Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano trilogy fights ran on Netflix and broke viewership records because they were on one accessible platform that already had global reach. Claressa's fight is being routed through a niche subscription service and a niche reality show streamer. That is not a business decision that maximizes revenue for the fighter. That is a business decision that maximizes revenue for whichever partners in the ecosystem have the deepest carve-outs on those specific platforms. Someone in that deal structure is getting a bigger piece by fragmenting the broadcast. That someone is not the fighter. And a real boxing manager, a Mark Taffet type, would have caught that and blocked it. But there is no Mark Taffet in that room anymore, because Mark Taffet is across the aisle now, managing Kaye Scott, watching the whole thing burn from a very comfortable distance. Which brings us to the biggest, most damaging, most underreported truth of this entire situation. And I need everybody watching this to understand what I am about to say, because it recontextualizes every headline we have seen about Claressa Shields in the last 12 months. The removal of Mark Taffet was not a business decision made by Claressa Shields. It was the precondition for the Win Records deal to happen at all. Think about it. If Mark Taffet, a former HBO boxing executive with 3 decades of institutional knowledge, is sitting in a room reviewing an $8 million contract structured with 7 or 8 stakeholders and a fragmented broadcast plan, and one of those stakeholders is the fighter's boyfriend in an executive role at the label paying the money, Mark Taffet is either killing that deal on the spot or he is renegotiating it into something unrecognizable. There is no version of this deal that survives contact with a real boxing manager doing his actual job. So Mark Taffet had to go. Not because he was bad at his job. He had to go because he was too good at his job. He had to go because a manager who does his job cannot let this deal get signed in the shape it got signed in. And Papoose, on his own podcast interview, said the quiet part out loud without realizing it. He said he was always taught to add on and never subtract. But the record is unambiguous. Mark Taffet was subtracted. Cleanly. Quietly. Without a farewell post, without a press release, without a professional acknowledgement of a 10-year working relationship. He was subtracted so that a deal could be added. And the deal that got added is a deal that benefits everyone in the room except the woman whose name is on the marquee. That is the reveal. That is the story. That is the reason Claressa Shields is fighting Kaye in Atlanta instead of Cris Cyborg at Madison Square Garden. That is the reason the champion who is headlining historic pay-per-views is now co-featured with Ray J on a Zeus stream. That is the reason the woman who told Charlemagne on The Breakfast Club that her boyfriend pays her mortgage is on camera at the gym asking that same boyfriend for money and getting told to stay in shape instead. The $8 million is not a payday. It is a leash. And the leash was measured and cut and tied in a room that used to have Mark Taffet in it and now does not. That is what happens when you fire the one person whose entire job was to protect you from exactly this outcome. And here is why the story does not end in tragedy. And here is why Remy Ma is going to be fine and Mark Taffet is going to be fine and the sport of women's boxing is going to be fine even if Claressa Shields spends the next 3 years running through fights on a fragmented broadcast with a fractional payout. Because the truth of professional boxing and the truth of professional life in general is that the people who do their jobs at 100%, the people who build institutional relationships across decades, the people who treat every deal like their reputation depends on it because it does, those people always land on their feet. Mark Taffet is not sitting at home crying about losing Claressa Shields. Mark Taffet is standing across the ring from Claressa Shields with a new champion he is managing in a spot that pays him just fine, with his industry reputation completely intact. That is the definition of unfazed. That is the definition of a professional who did his job the right way for so long that when the door closed on one client, 3 more doors opened on the other side. Remy Ma is dropping music that people are actually listening to, doing choreography for the Knicks parade, glowing up in real time while the man who tried to bury her narrative is still doing budget response videos from what looks like a hallway. Kaye, the fighter nobody was talking about 6 months ago, just got the biggest opportunity of her career because a real manager saw a real opportunity and took it. The system, when you leave it alone, tends to reward the people who show up prepared and punish the people who show up leveraged. And what we are watching in real time is the system doing what it always does. The champion who tried to shortcut the manager, the champion who tried to route her career through her boyfriend's record label, the champion who told her 10-year friend to shut up when the friend asked reasonable questions about the boyfriend. That champion is currently the least interesting version of her career she has ever been. 25 pounds over her natural weight by her own admission. Wearing wigs because her hair situation is a whole conversation of its own. Fighting a middleweight nobody was demanding on a broadcast most fans cannot access without paying for 2 separate platforms. Meanwhile, the manager she released is doing more meaningful work than she is. Meanwhile, the wife whose marriage she got in the middle of is having a better year in music than the record executive she signed with. That is not karma being cruel. That is karma being mathematical. The receipts add up in one direction, and that direction does not favor the version of the story Claressa is currently selling. But this is only the start, and I need everybody who has made it this far in the video to pay very close attention to what I am about to tell you, because there are 2 specific developments coming that are going to move this entire story forward in a way that most of the boxing media is not tracking yet. The first is what happens on Fight Night in Atlanta on August 15th. If Claressa Shields loses to Kaye, A fighter managed by her own former manager, on a card structured to fragment her own audience, with a Zeus network undercard nobody wanted. The entire Win Records boxing division is going to have to explain to its investors why the $8 million face of their operation just got beaten by a woman who was ranked outside the top 5 12 months ago. That conversation is going to happen behind closed doors, and the fallout from that conversation is going to reshape her entire team within the next 90 days. The second development is what happens with the manager conversation itself, because the pressure on Claressa to publicly name a current manager is going to become unbearable the closer we get to fight week. Sanctioning bodies require paperwork. Networks require paperwork. Athletic commissions require paperwork. There is a name on that paperwork right now, and sooner or later that name is going to be public, and when it is, we are going to know exactly whose interests have been steering this career for the last 12 months. So subscribe right now if you have not already, because when either of those two shoes drops, this channel is going to be the first place breaking down what it means. And if you thought this video was in depth, wait until you see the next one. Because coming up next, I am going deep on the exact clause in the Win Records deal that I believe forces Claressa into 3 specific opponents over the next 24 months, regardless of what she or any real manager would prefer. And once you understand which 3 opponents are on that list, and why those 3 specifically, you are going to understand that the $8 million number was never the point. The opponents were the point. And whoever benefits from those specific opponents being locked in is the person who has actually been running Claressa Shields' career since Mark Taffet walked out of the room. Click the next video. Do not miss it. We are just getting started.